This is The Speaking Show. I'm David Newman, and you're tuned in to the #1 podcast for speakers, consultants, and experts who want to speak more profitably. All right, I am here with the awesome and amazing Tom Davidson, CSP, Certified Speaking Professional, who is a guru of two things. Number one, niching and target marketing. And number two, a brilliant podcasting and interviewing strategy for and with his target market. So, Tom, welcome to the show.
Awesome. Thanks for the opportunity to be with you, David. I appreciate this very much.
So let's start. I want to start by kind of just telling folks kind of who you are and who you serve and kind of how you came to this fabulous thing that you're doing now with Leadership Nature. And then let's pivot that right into the podcast strategy and some very interesting things that you have done and are doing with that podcast that many people are not, but they probably should.
Yeah, I'd be glad to give you a little background on my journey. I don't think it's unlike other people's in some ways and probably very unlike people's in other ways. By the way, it's similar. I'm a leadership professional, leadership development, organization development professional. So a lot of people are under that umbrella, right, David? It's one of the top three. We are all fall out of the sky as leadership professionals. I became interested in this, though, in a scientific and technical background. So I'm actually a professional forester by original training, and one of the few professional foresters that probably took a deep interest in people along the way and gravitated into roles and positions that had to do with that. So my corporate journey took me to HR, communications, and training. And then after being on the right side of a merger, I decided to hang up my shingle and see what I could do as an entrepreneur, solopreneur, as you know.
So let's talk about that specialization. And I know that you've done all kinds of presentations for our National Speakers Association colleagues about going from little-known generalist to well-known specialist. Tell us about how that unfolded when you started to look at your podcasting strategy and what your original vision for that podcast was, both as a media source and also as a perhaps prospecting strategy.
Yeah, and a wind up to the podcast strategy, which was added to a few others. I don't want people to think that I jumped on the target marketing bandwagon right away. It was about a 10-year struggle, and I mean struggle. You know, being anything to anybody, throwing spaghetti on the marketing wall, that kind of thing, trying to find out what my niche was, turning my back on my niche. And people look back on my niche and say, yeah, it's a very natural thing. Obviously, Tom, that's an easy choice for you to make. Your niche seems very appropriate to you. Being a forester, an outdoors guy, of course you would find that to be your natural niche. But I turned away from it for years and years and years and finally got brave enough to make a call to you, as a matter of fact, having made the decision to what I call make a leap of focus about target marketing. And that began a whole new phase of business for me that took in target marketing strategies, doing things for and with people in forestry, natural resources. I like to say people who work outside with their boots on. Yeah, partly because they know my stories, they laugh at my jokes. We connect really, really easily. It seems like a very small niche, but it's actually enough work in this niche, I think, for 10 lifetimes. But bringing us forward a little bit to the podcast after we got started and branded my business as Leadership Nature, because great leaders don't grow on trees, of course. Then I wrote for publications that were in my niche and target market. I like to say I like to go where my clients' eyeballs and earballs are. So I speak at national conventions, I speak at regional conventions, I write in the newsletters that they read, I write in the journals that they read, where their eyeballs and earballs are. So that's one way I get in front of their eyeballs and earballs. About 2 years ago, I took another leap of focus with the podcast, David. And the idea really stemmed from several colleagues that I also know from you who did something similar. And the idea with my podcast is the strategy, the business strategy for it, is to meet higher level decision makers and solve bigger problems. That's the strategy for the podcast. not to be famous, not to have a million hits and likes and so forth, but for the opportunity to meet, build relationships with, learn about the challenges for higher level decision makers and help solve bigger problems. And that has come true. It also has had the added benefit, as you might imagine, of deepening my visibility in the market, becoming more well-known. And then I've segmented it to some degree too, actually a large degree, which I'll tell you more about. But that kind of brings us to the when and why and wherefores of why the podcast in my particular niche.
And let's go right there, because you've done something really smart, which is to break your podcast into quote unquote seasons. And when you and I were talking about this before, there's the concept of Netflix and Hulu and all these internet TV series where we've gotten used to having seasons and we've gotten used to binge watching. Season 1 of Downton Abbey, or season 5 of Orange is the New Black, or season 6 of whatever your favorite show is. And you've done your seasons along some thematic lines, and the themes that you chose were also very specific and very intentional. So talk about how that came to be.
Yeah, absolutely. And came to be is a good way to put it, because it's a discovery along the way. I'm kind of excited to share with you and others. When I started the podcast, I really didn't know about this idea of seasons. So I did about my first 20 episodes that were very generic in my network, outside my network, very eclectic, I should say, very eclectic people. They're all great interviews. Towards the end of that first season, I now call them seasons, of about 20 interviews or so, sometimes more, sometimes less, I attended a workshop at the National Convention of my target market, the Society of American Foresters. And it was a Women in Forestry session. And it was fascinating for me, the topic, what I learned at it. And that's what motivated me to say I could do a whole series, I didn't call them seasons at first, on women in forestry and natural resources. I think it would be needed. I think it would be learning. I think it would be neat. I think I would be able to meet more people that way. And I think that particular group and all these groups will talk to each other about the podcast and share the podcast, which is what I want to see. So that became a season 2. Season 2, Women in Forestry and Natural Resources. Then I picked season 3 was Young Professionals in Forestry and Natural Resources, because that's important to our profession, like it is to a lot of others. Season 4 was Our State Foresters. So almost every state in the union has a agency executive in charge of the forestry programs in that state. And so when I reached out to all the state foresters, I got 25 responses immediately and had over 20 interviews with state foresters who probably had no real strong reason to talk to me any other time. But I've since built great relationships with them. I've been invited to do workshops for them. They publish my podcast in their newsletter, a very niche newsletter, the National Association of State Foresters. So again, it deepens and widens my reach within my target market. My season 5, David, is called Professionals of Color in Forestry and Natural Resources. And this market, this profession of mine, forestry and all natural resources, is not known for its diversity. It's a challenge. It's an important process, I think, to improve diversity in our profession. And by reaching out and interviewing folks who've gone very far, very successful, learn their journeys, what's their story, what's their advice for young people, I think it's helping the profession. But again, folks in that target market, that niche, tend to share these with others in that niche. And I have a hashtag, Forestry of Color, to improve the accessibility of my podcasts on Twitter. So that's a short story. I'm in my 5th season. My 6th season will be Forestry Consultants. Probably the 7th season will be Fire Professional. Wildland firefighting is a huge part of this profession. So again, that's sort of a snapshot of several niches with lots of benefits.
I want to just underscore something. And when you and I were preparing for this interview, this just totally blew my head off. This Association of State Foresters. So there's 50 states, the last time that I counted. There are 50 state foresters, and that is the sum total of this association, correct?
That is right. It's even a little smaller because a few states don't actually have state foresters, but most do. So close enough. That's the sum total of the association. They're even divided into regions. They work on different regional challenges. They have different offices across the country. It's very active, very rich They have phenomenal connections with each other. They trust each other's advice. They ask for advice. So it's a small town within a small town.
Well, and I want to channel our listener, because our listener is saying, oh, well, there's no way that I could get someone on a podcast who's really important. There's no way I could get someone who's really in an exclusive group, who's a senior executive, who's a CEO. What Tom is talking about is a group that is so small and so elite. This is more exclusive than the United States Congress that has 535 members. This is more elite than the United States Senate that has 100 members, 2 members from every state. This is like the governors. This is like 50 people who have 50 jobs in these 50 states, and that is it. And like Tom just said, it's not even that big because, maybe there's 42, 43, 38 of them. We don't know how many. Tom knows how many. But my point is, for you to have sent out the invitation to these 50 top executives in your niche and to immediately get 20 responses from exactly as you said, they don't really have a big reason to talk to you. They don't need the credibility. They don't need the exposure. There's no money in this for them. There's no glory. Well, a little bit of glory. There might be a little bit of glory. I mean, let's be honest. But there's no selfish reason. There's no monetary reason that they would do this other than their ego, other than wanting to be seen as a leader in that field and wanting to have the prestige of being interviewed and share their opinions, share their insights, share their opinions, share their perspectives on what they're going through on these critical issues that Tom's going to ask them about. So I just want to give you a huge amount of credit for not thinking small and for going big. And, we all have this little bit of an imposter syndrome, maybe. Was that a factor for you when you approached these guys, or were you so well established that that wasn't really a big obstacle for you?
Oh, no, it's always an obstacle. I think that's changing a little bit. Well, I have a story to tell you, but I would say that the right word is probably they are proud. They're proud of what they do. They're proud of their profession. They're proud of their agencies. And it's an opportunity for them to not just share lessons they've learned about leadership, which is the theme of the interview. What's your story? What's your journey? What are your lessons in leadership? What's your advice? What's your career advice? People are proud and happy to share that. As you taught me and others have, what's your advice? What's your information? What are your referrals? People are happy to say, what are you proud of? I like to ask that question. They're proud, and they like to have an opportunity to share what they're proud of. I think that probably characterizes the reason for the callbacks. But here's a quick example. I won't say what state it was, but I had been trying to reach a state forester in a state where I wasn't well known. The person didn't have any real reason to talk to me. I'm just one of 1,000 vendors who reach out to them, every week. And I hadn't heard back from them. I wasn't terribly discouraged, but I thought it would be fun to go ahead and reach out to them during this podcast series to see if they'd like to be interviewed for the show. And with that one email, so I hadn't heard from them, David, in maybe 7 or 8, I'm not exaggerating, 7 or 8 other attempts, phone calls, emails, the usual kind of outreach. With that one email, they got back to me the next day. I'd be delighted to be on the show. Please share the next steps. Absolutely. I look forward to scheduling with you. That was different.
Amazing. Whoa, what a great interview. Are you taking notes? Remember to visit thespeakingshow.com for complete show notes, links, downloads, and resources related to this episode. See you over there. Well, let's do a little inside baseball. Tell us, how do you prep people? Kind of what's the pre-interview sequence, if any? Do you ask them some questions in advance? What do you send ahead? Do you ask for their photo? Do you ask for some biographical information? And then tell us how you navigate the interview itself, because obviously there's some intentionality behind your questioning strategy. And then what do you do after the interview to follow up and continue building on that relationship?
I started by sending, of course, that first outreach, not a long outreach, not a long explanation of what the podcast is, but an example of it, the purpose of it, someone else who's been on the program that they know. That was very useful in the introduction phase. Well, so-and-so has been interviewed for the program. Maybe I should be too. And then the ask then, David, is, would you like more information so that we can proceed with scheduling the interview? Like to proceed? Then the answer to that is yes. And sometimes it took a couple of pings to get that yes to the next step. That's when I'd send a 2-sided one sheet One side being introduction to the program, the logistics, which, as you mentioned, talk about how long the call is, how that will be done. I'll use a Skype recording system. I'll call a landline. At some point, I'd like a short bio that you approve of. I like to say that you approve of because they'll know that I can always find their bio anyway, but I want to make sure I get one that they approve of. I'll eventually need a photo or two or three for the posting. And for some of those, I've gotten pictures of them, certainly behind the desk in front of the flag, showing their patch, whatever it might be, but also photos of them in the field, which they really like sharing too, on fires in the woods, doing what they do. So I'll add those into the podcast as well. So that's the logistics side. The back is what I call the baseline questions, David, and I describe these as food for thought, fodder for the interview. And I tell them I'm not going to follow these like a script. There'll be follow-up questions. I'll skip around. The idea is to have a conversation just like you and I are having right now, not for them to feel like they have to follow a script. But I think that they appreciate having the ideas of the things that I'll be talking about in advance, which I outlined earlier. Tell us about how you got started, how you got interested, what was your journey, what were some of the most interesting jobs, fun jobs, what are you proud of? What advice do you have for other things that you wish you'd learned sooner that someone had told you? Advice for young professionals coming into the field. So those are the baseline questions. I end also with 3 final questions. That's a kind of a normal, or that's a standard wrap up to the show, so people are familiar with the closing as well. And those questions are, what book or movie do you like to recommend to people with an important message about these subjects? What favorite quote or saying do you like to remember? And sometimes people give the most amazing quotes from their moms and their dads. You know, it's really cool. And the last one is, do you think leaders are born or made? And people land on all parts of that spectrum, as you can imagine. So it's a thoughtful, reflective. That's an easy wrap up to the show. I've got a bumper intro, an outro. I've got a short commercial near the beginning. And these are all packaged up by a service I use called Podfly, which are lots of good vendors of that. But this, so no one's sponsoring the podcast yet, except me. So this little commercial, just after I say, welcome to the program, we'll be talking with guests, describe who the guest is, learning their lessons in leadership and their advice for you, but first a word from leadership nature. Of course, all my guests were here and all the people they referred to were here. And then we come right back and start the interview just as you did. So that's how the packaging goes, David. Let's see. You asked me a couple other questions along the way.
Yeah, the follow-up. So after the interview is a wrap, you say, hey, Bob, hey, Susan, thanks for being on. What is your follow-up sequence to kind of keep them warm and keep them in your circle of relationships?
Right, something we can all do better of, including me. My first thing I do is I write a handwritten thank you note, and I use greeting cards that might be fun for you to hear about because of my target market. My wife is a photographer, a nature photographer. She has a wonderful library of nature photography. So I have customized greeting cards. I handwrite a thank you, acknowledge some of the things we talked about. And I put that in a wooden envelope. So David, again, target marketing, right? My niche is used to me using wood products. I've got very thin micro veneer business cards, micro veneer envelopes. They're quite beautiful. They're very intriguing. People pass them around the office. They don't throw them away. And so I send them a thank you note in a wood envelope. It sounds like it would be heavy, right? But it's not that much heavier. It's quite beautiful. Then they keep track of what we talked about. They talk about the things that are challenging to them now. They talk about them on the air. They talk about challenges with the next generation. They talk about challenges with retention. They talk about challenges with succession. Hey, guess what? All these are up my alley. And so I'll also learn that they've just had a change in staff. They've been through some major change. Something's just around the corner with them. All these come up in the informal and the formal conversation. So it gives me plenty of reasons to circle back with them and check on what those issues were, offer a little bit of advice, a resource or two here and there. And then eventually, I wonder if I could help you with that. Here's the kind of thing that we could discuss. So it unfolds, but it's unfolding based on something that they're proud of and on, guess what, their relationship.
By now, Tom, you've spoken to hundreds and hundreds of guests. Between the follow-up and all of that kind of genius follow-up sequence that you just laid out when they talk about various problems and issues and who talked about what and when did I interview them, do you use some sort of customer relationship management software to keep track of your guests, to keep track of the relationships, to keep track of who you've interviewed and who you have yet to interview? Or how do you keep track of these hundreds of new relationships that the podcast creates?
Yeah, I know that people are going to have their favorite form of that, from spreadsheets on up to much more sophisticated tools than I use. But I use Pipedrive. I've been using that for a couple of years because it's simple. I like simple. I probably need something even simpler, a dumbed down version of it. But that's how I keep up. And that's how I know when to follow up, what to follow up about, what we did talk about. I can also prioritize and put how frequently I'd like to follow up, what I've sent them, so I don't lose track of who I sent what to, and then make a fool of myself by repeating something. But yeah, it's a fairly simple system. I think probably people are very familiar with that, but I believe there's probably dozens more that people could use. But that whole idea, I guess the principle of why you're asking that question is it gets to be a blur of who you talked to, what they said, what you'd sent them, what to do next, when to call them back. A couple of the state foresters, since we talked about them, for example, said, get back to me after fire season. Of course, while we're recording this, wildfire, fire season, fire protection is a big part of my profession. They are completely head down, got no time to talk to anybody like me when the wildfires are burning. So even asking them, okay, does that mean for you? Some states, fire season ends at different times. Is that August or September? No, they didn't get back to me. They were already too busy. So I'll put down to get back to them in certain states in September and certain states longer after that. But otherwise, they just fall right off my radar, and they sometimes still do.
Now, you've done hundreds and hundreds of episodes. What number are we up to?
Well, it's not quite hundreds, David, but thanks. It soon will be, but I'm approaching 100 episodes, and that's weekly. And if anybody's curious about that, it's not that you or I or anybody doing podcasts necessarily goes online weekly, does an interview and posts it. We put them in the can. I hope that's the right term. I think it is. We put them in the can, we record them, we put them in the editing process. So I right now have about 15 interviews in raw file form that I will go back through and edit, send to the editor. And I'm pretty meticulous about this. This is a little bit of a sidebar, David. I'm pretty meticulous. I'm not sure that all podcasters are this meticulous about it, because I really, really want them to be proud of the results. And if they mention somebody's name or said something they didn't mean to have a negative impact on another audience, or if they lose their train of thought in any way, I'll go back and take those out. Sometimes I'll discuss things with them. And sometimes, David, this is how meticulous I am, I'll sometimes send them the raw file, especially if I have enough time. And I'm now far enough ahead where I can do that. Sometimes they want their communications people to listen to it too. And that's highly variable by the organization and the agency and their preferences. But they like this, I think, this very friendly nature of this. They feel comfortable and certain that I've got their back. This is going to sound good. It's going to look good. It's going to read well. People are going to be proud to share it with others. There's even a level of editing that is called premier editing. So this costs me a little bit more, but again, I'm very particular about this quality of the product. I think it reflects on my brand. It reflects on them. It's important in my small town. The premium editing, David, is taking out the ums and the uhs. Some people are just endemic with it, as you know. It doesn't make them sound all that great. In fact, probably some people who hear a person being interviewed who know them well, they're probably wondering what happened to their ums and uhs. I think that's a very professional thing to do. I think it suits them well. I think they appreciate it. They might not even know that I did it, but that's the meticulous nature of the edit.
That's how we all sound in our heads, right? No ums, no ahs, no verbal tics of any kind.
That's probably right.
Let me go back to something that you said that you just kind of dropped it in as a by the way, and I think it is complete and utter genius, which is that you now, with some of your target associations and affiliation groups, they are syndicating and or redistributing your podcast in their newsletter, on their website, to their members, to their constituencies. Tell us how that works, because that could be a gold mine And was that an easy offer to make? Was that an easy yes? Did that involve some haggling and negotiating? How do you get a target client group or association to be so excited about your podcast or your content that they want to share it out to their members through their channels?
It's exciting, isn't it? It's happened in one particular case, National Association of State Foresters. I'm now approaching the Nature Conservancy. I hope people don't mind me mentioning their name, that they might want to carry the podcast, particularly for the Professionals of Color series, because they do a similar leadership, Leaders of Nature panel. So I'm looking for opportunities where this content will add value to their newsletter. Newsletter editors, a couple that I've talked to, also the Society of American Foresters, they love this because I'm basically doing for them work that they don't have time to do or the bandwidth to do. Feature their members in audio podcasts that can go viral. They don't have to do it. I just provide it for them. Another group I'm hoping to work with along the same vein of the Association of Consulting Foresters. There's niches within niches within niches who've got newsletters or their own electronic newsletters in most cases who don't mind putting a little paragraph in there, a link, feature one of their members, somebody that they're proud of. There's no downside for them to do that I can think of. It's just a matter of, do they have a channel that they can add this to with little difficulty and virtually no downside. So I'm going to continue to follow that route myself, David. It's not a broad strategy that's successful yet, but I'm going to continue to follow that with each audience, with each sub-niche, if you will, with each season, because I like it as well.
Tom, that's a brilliant strategy. My next question is, do you ever ask a guest what affiliation groups or trade and professional associations they belong to so that you can introduce the idea of having them share this or perhaps refer you or introduce you to the person that might be the decision maker about syndicating your content elsewhere?
I haven't done enough of that. That's the simple answer to that, David. I haven't done enough of that. It does come up in conversation. And because I'm so deeply embedded in the profession, I know a lot of these side associations and lateral affiliations that they've got. So they do come up in conversation anyway. And there's a long list of associations that we're all part of in this profession. You think of the state foresters, you think of industry associations, you think every state has a forestry association for landowners. There are affiliate associations of Society of American Foresters, consulting foresters. There are just so many relationships that people have. Then there's county associations and state associations. There are logging professional associations and training associations that they all belong to. So you ask such a good question. It's a strategy I need to do more of and more deliberately rather than just stumbling upon them, I think, in my interview process. So thank you for that, David.
Fantastic. Well, so two quick final questions, Tom, as we're wrapping things up. My final question is going to be, how can listeners learn more about you and stay connected to you and your business or any resources that you might like to share with them? But before I get to that question, if our listeners took only one thing away from this conversation about this very hyper-targeted podcasting strategy, what would you hope that that one thing would be?
The language that we use about target marketing, people are very familiar with. I don't think people are familiar with this idea, something I've learned, which has to do with not just the target, if you're picturing the concentric circles, target, because healthcare is a target market, right? Transportation is a target market, banking, they're all targets, but they're huge. They're still huge. They're too big. I like to talk about the bullseye itself and getting inside the bullseye. I think people get close to the bullseye and then they think there's not going to be enough work in there. I'll starve to death. If you think about how small my target market sounds, but once you get inside of it and identify the very middle of that bullseye, you'll see that the bullseye is full of affiliated organizations like suppliers and government agencies, affiliated professions to your target market, associations, sub-professions, consulting professions, education, industry. It's a huge amount of work that lies inside the bullseye if you just break through that outer perimeter of the bullseye. So it's not just finding a target, it's finding the bullseye. Once you're inside the bullseye, David, It's what I call the small town effect. And in a small town, people talk to each other. In a small town, people look out for each other. In a small town, people know each other's business. And that's the nature. When you found a bullseye and gotten inside the bullseye, people talk about you. People trust you. You contribute to your small town. And I think the one takeaway is don't stop at a target market. Get inside the bullseye and benefit from the nature of it being a small town.
Totally fantastic. So let's say people totally fall in love with Tom Davidson and Leadership Nature, which by now they have. How can people get connected to you? How can they stay connected to you and your ongoing adventures?
Ongoing adventures, well, we're talking about them on LinkedIn, of course, Leadership Nature on Twitter. You can find my hashtags there and get linked to my podcast there. Of course, my website, leadershipnature.com. We've got a tab. You can pick the podcast tab, and you can, of course, sign up to receive the podcast. Also, once you go on my website and perhaps download a nice freebie there about helping your training stick, you'd be added to my newsletter list, and I'd be in touch with you that way on a regular basis. But I'd really be happy for fellow speakers to reach out to me. I'll be happy to send them a sample of the pre-work, that two-sided one sheet. If that gives them a good template to use for their podcast, I'd be happy to send that. I have a couple other things I can send as examples as well. So I'm really happy to help fellow speakers learn from my journey. Thanks for asking.
Totally fantastic. And we're going to put links to all of that in the show notes so that people can just click and go and click and connect with the awesome and amazing Tom Davidson. Thank you, my friend. And of course, because it's you and me, because it's me and you, I have to tell you that I have your shirt.
I've got your shirt too, David.
No, I've got your shirt.
No, I've got your shirt. I thought it was me that had your shirt.
So if you guys have no idea what we're talking about, you may have to email us. You may have to email Tom. You may have to email me. You may have to go to the show notes, hear that little story. And I appreciate you, my friend. Thanks for being on with us.
Man, you've been such a great help to me and so many others, David. It's an honor. Always want to help you in any way I can. Thank you, sir.
Well, that wraps up another episode of The Speaking Show. Hey, tell you what, if you like us, rate us and review us on iTunes. Subscribe. Tell a friend. Go grab the notes and downloads and extras at thespeakingshow.com. See you next time.